My talk is about the human dimension in aquatic plastic pollution. And actually, Thilo has sort of summarized the gist, which I'm very grateful for. So I probably don't need to explain too much, Thilo, thank you. But what I need to start with is this idea of the plastic system. So, oh, this is not moving forward. So, what has been alluded to already is that there are these wicked problems. Plastic is one of them. There's not one single source. There's not one single actor. We really need to think about this as a holistic system. And for plastic, for example, this involves various sectors. It involves producing sectors. It involves society, consuming plastic. And at the end of the day, this is an environmental engagement lecture. We have issues in that plastic leaks from the system and ends up in the natural environment. And that's in many cases the trigger, the motivation for change, for policy change, for behavior change. And that's really where the evidence has come from so far. So it's different sectors involved. We're looking at the entire system. And this applies to macro, micro and nanoplastics. And the latter, nanoplastics, we don't really know that much about. So there's a huge question mark about what that actually means and how it affects us. So why am I talking about this as a psychologist? Psychology is the science of thought and action. And my argument is very simple. As Thilo already said, in the system, you find decisions and behavior almost at every part of the system. So in the cosmetics sector, you might find someone who decides to add plastic bits to cosmetics for a certain functionality, like facial scrubs, for example. There's a reason for this. Maybe they thought, oh, this is great, it's very cheap, we can use rubbish from other sectors, from other parts of the production. It's also anti-allergenic. There's a problem when we use natural materials. So many good reasons for having this, but they might not have thought about the response that people have to this at the other end of the chain. So if people find out about these things being added, they might not like it. Similar in consumption, so citizens can make decisions about products, they can look at what they contain and decide for or against them. And then even, I said, the end point is often the impact in the environment. We have very active citizen groups, we've got environmental groups who go and clean up waste and rubbish from the sea. So decisions and behavior permeate the whole system. And as a psychologist, I can talk about this, I can talk about the perceptions, I can research perceptions and communications, and then understand what drives behavior and change it. And it's quite important to point out this doesn't just affect the general public. That's one group in society, but there are many other groups that influence how plastic is used and where it ends up. And there are different mechanisms of change. Maybe that's the last point here. I said there's not one actor or one source for plastic pollution. And there are mechanisms of change bottom up, so-called community groups, for example, or top down, where new laws, a ban gets introduced. And the risk there is if we don't think through how people think about this, how they will respond to it, it will backfire. A new technology gets invented, say biodegradable plastics. People have no idea what to do with it, and it really makes a big problem. It doesn't solve the problem, it creates additional problems. So that's the simple thought of me as a psychologist getting involved in this issue of plastic. So a few years back, we wrote about this. We were trying to convince natural scientists and people in the technical sciences to think about the human dimension and make these arguments. And I just want to point out a few of the conclusions about the insights we came to here. The first one I think is quite important. Human perceptions and behavior can be subject to systematic and rigorous scientific study, just like other things. There are certain things that don't work so well with humans, but there are certain things that work really well. For example, you can ask them what they think about something. You can't do that with a snail or a mussel or something. And there are different methods for applying research to this topic area, from qualitative methods, in-depth, to quantitative methods. What I'll try to do in the talk is give you a little overview, a little feel for the things we've done to research this issue. And I want to start with the thoughts part, so the perception part. Often this is a motivator for policy change. So people come to me and ask, so why do people worry about this? Or why don't they worry about this? And I look at the data and I try to explain this. So I want to start with a study we did a few years ago that was funded under the FP7 program, still by the EU, where we simply wanted to know how concerned are people about this environmental issue. We focused on marine litter here because marine litter has a high plastic content. We thought this is actually useful to know. And this is just showing you some of the questions we asked our participants. This is an EU-wide sample with different stakeholder groups, so just over 3,500 people. We asked them a few questions about the extent of the problem. So marine litter is an important problem. To what extent do you agree? The quantity of litter is increasing. I'm very concerned. Standard, typical questions. We also gave them the opportunity to express skepticism or to say, well, you know what, I don't think marine litter is that big a problem. And what you can see is that they quite strongly agreed with the yes, it is a problem, and quite strongly disagreed with the skepticism items. So, for example, marine litter is a problem elsewhere, but not in my country. So overall, what we concluded from this is that people think it's a problem, they're concerned about it, and there's hardly any denial. This is quite interesting in the context of other environmental issues, because climate change, for example, in particular, there is considerable denial, and it's been a problem. There's lobbyism, people who fund research against climate change, and many publics are split. They think it might be a hoax. People might be making this up. And so far, anyway, we don't really see that for plastic. So in that sense, it's a nice environmental problem to tackle because we don't have this split in society. The other thing you can do with this sort of data is ask what explains the concern. And if I just briefly summarize a further analysis we did, we asked which type of factor helps us understand concern. And we looked at socio-demographic factors. We found that age and education level were a predictor. So the older people were, the more they realized this was a problem, or the more concerned they were, the more highly educated they were. That's a sort of interesting finding. But what we also found is other things were really important. So the more they reported noticing litter, the more they were concerned. The more they reported having altruistic biospheric values, so caring about others, caring about the environment, the more they were concerned. And also the more other people around them reported worrying about marine litter and wanting to do something, the more they were concerned. And that's, I think, quite important from a psychology point of view, because those are things you could potentially do something about. You can change a social norm. You can probably change values. Whereas if you look at socio-demographic factors, you can't change that. That's not the starting point for change. The second question we asked, that I want to just show you, is how big is the problem? So we asked people a knowledge question. How much plastic litter is in marine litter in terms of percent? And this is where the first audience question comes in. So Judith, could you start this? And what I'd like to ask you is, what's the percentage of plastic found in beach litter? And this means in terms of items. So this is based on big studies where people went around, I think it was 7 European countries, and counted what was there. And just put the nearest to whatever number you think it is. That's good. We've got over 80 people already. 90. 106. Excellent. Oh. Judith, can you share the results? Well, I'm quite impressed. Can I move this to the side? Because you've probably already glimpsed what the people in our study told us. And what's important to know about this data is that we now split people by stakeholder group. So earlier I showed you everyone, the responses averaged across the whole sample. And now I'm showing you what people in the different sectors said. And for example, people in design and manufacturing said, oh, sorry about that. said around 40, a bit more than 40. People in retail said just under 40%, etc., etc. The highest we found was people in environmental organizations. They said 55. Now, comparing that with your responses, I'm very impressed because the real answer is 75. And a lot of you, around a third, is spot on. So maybe you're experts in marine or in plastic. That explains that. But overall, very well done. And actually, you're extremely close. A lot of them. A lot of you also said very low, which is interesting because what we're seeing now is that there's quite a discussion around the importance of plastic in the context of other environmental risks. And that's something I've heard discussed a lot in policy context. I've also heard it discussed with other scientists. And for that reason, I want to show you another study which tries to understand how important people think plastic is as an environmental issue, as an environmental problem. Sorry, I'm just going to skip through this. And so this is an Australian sample, representative Australian sample. Ours was not representative, so this is slightly better in methodology, where people were asked to indicate how serious they think each of the following environmental issues are. And those issues are on the right-hand side. You can see it's plastic, amount of plastic at the top there, amount of general waste. And they included other things such as endangered species and biodiversity. We heard this already, that's an important issue. Air pollution, water shortages, and climate change as well. And this is actually the order that people said they were important in. So plastic right at the top, and climate change was the lowest in this list. It wasn't really, really low because the ratings went from 1 to 10, but it's clearly lower than plastic. And there's a big, big debate around the appropriateness of this perception. So is plastic overhyped? Why is there so much funding being thrown at plastic? Are we forgetting other issues that are really, really important? Because arguably climate change and biodiversity are really important topics. So this particular study has looked at general perceptions of environmental issues. It didn't specify who the harm would come to. So is this a worry, a concern about wildlife that's being affected? Is it a concern about human health? And again, this is a big debate now, and I want to show you a second study, one that we did ourselves that's currently under review, where we asked in particular about concern regarding human health from marine threats. So again, we asked people to think about a whole range of issues that are damaging in the marine environment. And we asked them specifically about these threats to human health. So we didn't want to know about wildlife now, we wanted to know about humans. And this is another large European study, again, using representative samples. So 13 different countries, 12 different countries in Europe plus Australia. And I know this is probably too small to see all the detail, but what I want you to take away from this slide is these are all the different countries from Australia, so alphabetical, Belgium, Bulgaria, Czech Republic. Sadly, we didn't have Austria at this point in time. I would love to know the perception of a country away from the sea. But what you can perhaps just about see is the point marked in the circle is the plastic pollution. So here at the bottom right, it's all countries together. Plastic pollution comes out top as the concern. This is what people are concerned about in terms of in terms of human health. And there are only 2 countries that are an exception, which is Poland, where plastic is second, and Greece, where plastic is second. So I think this is quite stunning because, to be honest, the evidence for human health effects is not great at the moment. There's a lot of discussion around this, and I will discuss a little more later. But in people's minds, it's a big issue already. So they think about human health when they think about plastic. This study, again, doesn't distinguish between different types of plastic. There are big items of plastic, such as those that you could see on a beachfront, on the coast. There are very small items of plastic, microplastics, for example. This study doesn't distinguish, it just says, what do you think about the human health concerns? And that's an issue to go away from the natural environments just for a moment. So we're still asking about the marine environment in this instance. This is because I've been part of a marine institute for many years, and a lot of my research is focused on marine. But I want to show you as the final study, this is not one of ours, a study that asked consumers about human health topics. This is by the Bundesinstitut für Risikobewertung, it's German data, again, a representative sample. And what you can see here is entirely separate from any environmental issues, just what people are concerned about. Microplastic in food is the second issue they're concerned about, only beaten by antibiotic resistance. And again, the evidence we heard earlier, we want to make evidence-based change. We want to transform, but only if we have good evidence that it's a problem. The evidence is very small at the moment. That's what my colleagues tell me. The other interesting thing perhaps to point out here is this is quite fresh data, 2020. And what you can see is that it's going down slightly. Now, whether this is because of COVID or because we're already beyond peak microplastics, I don't know. But I think that's also quite interesting. That's slightly lower than it was earlier last year. So it's not a surprise, perhaps, given this public perception data, that people respond to it. And here's just a couple of examples. I like walking around shops and finding things. So on the left-hand side, this is a shower gel that I bought in Vienna, which is being sold with this label without microplastics. So clearly, producers now think that's something that attracts people, that sells products. And here's an example. This is actually the Swiss Consumer Protection Agency online advice, microplastics, what can you do against them? And to some scientists who are perhaps rather skeptical and say, we have to deal with other problems. Why are people so incredibly worried about microplastics? This is fascinating. And they are saying to me, why is this happening? So why do people want to know this when really the problem isn't as big perhaps as people think? So in sum, plastic is a big topic for the general public and for stakeholders, for consumers specifically as well. And that's within the marine context and also outside the marine context. And I want to come back to this later for the policy context. I've done some work with policymakers. But first of all, I want to talk a little bit about behavior change. This is a talk about transformations, about achieving change and so on. And also to me as a psychologist, this is something that's close to my heart because I don't just want to describe. It's really important to understand what people think about plastic, what they're worried about and so on. But in my view, it's just as important or possibly even more important to understand how we can change their behavior, how we can work within the system to reduce plastic, to change use, to use different materials and so on. So I want to give you a few examples about behavior change, things we've done in the past, and what you might realize if you know a bit about behavior change is that in environmental psychology and in environmental topics, the behavior change programs are rather new and they often don't quite reach the gold standard of, say, medical research where you do a randomized controlled trial. We're only just starting to apply these methods to the environmental domain. So that just as a sort of preamble. So the first study I want to show you is a few years ago, again, within the Malisco project, the FP7 funded project. We were working as part of a large interdisciplinary consortium of people trying to reduce marine litter and understand public perception about marine litter. It's the same data I showed you earlier. And part of our role was to evaluate activities, actions that these other partners of ours did with certain groups. So for example, young people, for example, fishermen, a few examples where they targeted particular groups. And in this example here, this is with children, school children, and the activity was a video contest. So they sent an invitation around Europe, around all the countries that were involved, and said, we're running a video contest, tell us something about marine litter in 2 minutes. That was the task. So what I liked about it is there was a lot of freedom, there was a lot of creativity. it only had to be about marine litter. So we received all these lovely videos from the children around Europe. And this is just to illustrate, this is my personal favorite. It's not even the one that won the UK part of the competition, but it's the one that was my personal favorite because it was a group of school children in the Shetland Islands, primary school children. And they came up with this little, so it's like a moving picture film. I've only put a few screenshots, and they talk about the fisherman who goes out from Shetland to catch his fish. And he has his lunch and throws the bottle overboard. And then the bottle gets washed up on the beach, and this poor bird picks it up and eats it, or eats part of it. And then he becomes sick, and the children are quite upset. And I love all of that. It's really nice to see the way they're thinking about it. And then at the end, they come up with this beautiful positive ending. They say, what do we do about it? We need to get everyone together, go down to the beach and clean up the rubbish that's on the beach. So it's all of this in 2 minutes, but it's a lovely overview. It's a lovely little film. And it also illustrates one thing that's really important. I've worked across lots of different environmental issues with people from other disciplines, energy, litter, plastic, and so on. And often what I hear from other disciplines is, well, we just need to educate the children, and the children will sort it out. Climate change, whatever it is. And I think we need to think about this a bit more carefully, and we can't just load everything on the children. If we do this, we need to engage them in a positive and constructive discussion and empower them so that they feel they can do something about it. It's not that they go from lesson to lesson and people say, and here's a problem, and this is what the problem is, and they get totally overwhelmed. So that just as a background to this particular study. And what we did around this video competition is we took a simple before and after self-report measure of behavior. This is the only way we could realistically do this all around Europe. And if I show you what we found here, this is self-reported behavior last week from 341 children. We actually managed to match the 2 time points. And what you can see is that they did more positive behaviors, so separated litter, those are the green bars, used reusables, avoided using plastic bags, encouraged others. The middle item is a really interesting one because we think that's one mechanism of change whereby children in particular, they talk to their parents, they talk to grandparents and tell them what to do or not to do. If you have children, I'm sure you know what I mean. And so on. The only thing that didn't change was throwing litter on the ground, and we were quite happy about that, and it was low beforehand and it stayed low. So this is one example of a study trying to understand how behavior varies and whether we can do something about it, in this case using a creative sort of entertaining evaluation, not a lesson plan or something. And I wanted to show you a second example of a particular stakeholder group. This was one where I got involved with the UK government. And they asked us, to evaluate a program called Fishing for Litter, which is where fishermen bring back litter when they go out fishing. They don't get paid for it, but there's an infrastructure, there are facilities where they can drop this off when they come back to the harbour. Now, this is great, we were really pleased, but they asked us after the fact. So the program had already been running for some time. And they said, oh, can you evaluate it now? And so it was a post hoc approach. We thought about it for a while and we thought, well, what can we do here? And we said, okay, we'll do a study, we'll talk to the fishermen. But the only thing we can do is compare those that are part of this program, Fishing for Litter, with those who aren't part of it. That's the only way in which we can learn something about this. And you can see the 2 things we asked them. If I find rubbish at sea, I keep hold of it, so it can't be disposed. So it can be disposed of on land. We find a difference between those part of Fishing for Litter and those not. That's not surprising because that's exactly what the program is about. It gives us some validation, but that's not the surprising finding. The nice finding, I think, is the one on the right-hand side, where people also are different in throwing stuff overboard, which apparently is quite a common thing amongst fisher folk. So those who weren't part of Fishing for Litter still reported doing that, around 35%. Those that were part of Fishing for Litter hardly ever did this. So that's perhaps an indication that the behavior changes. What we can't rule out is that they differed from the start. So those who were already more motivated joined the program, those who weren't did not. We can't do that in a postdoc study, but we did our best, I think. The other thing perhaps to note here is, so we employed 2 psychologists, two young women, and they had to go to all these harbors around the country. So there were 4 sites in the southwest. You can actually see Plymouth there on the map, and 4 sites in Scotland. And this is not something you get trained for in your psychology degree, to go out to harbors at 3 o'clock in the morning and talk to fishermen. And at least they could understand the ones in southwest England. The ones in Scotland was a real problem. So they had to record things and then slowly pick this apart later on. So the things you can do when you're a psychologist. So there are some indications that behavior is variable and it can change, but to be honest, there's not a lot of good evidence right now. And there's really not a lot on the process. How do we change behavior? And before I talk a bit more about things, factors that encourage behavior change, I would like to do a second interaction. So there's a couple of questions. Judith, if you could start that one. And they're simply survey items. 2 questions. Please indicate whether you agree on this 5-point scale. And you have to scroll down a little bit to see the bottom of it. This is great. I'll give people a few more seconds. I can also see that people are still there and listening, which is good. Do you want to share it, Judith, if people... So I hope you can see the results now. The first question was about giving people scientific facts. Is that good, or is it the most effective method of changing behaviors? I formulated this quite strongly, and nearly 50% of you think, yes, agree, that's the most effective method. The second question was about making people fearful and scared. And this is interesting because it's much more split. Still a slight majority, well, slight 37% think agree, that works, but also 32 people disagree. So that's quite interesting. Bearing that in mind, I'm just going to put that down, and I'll explain a little bit about factors that influence behavior. So this is a bit of a selective choice from the literature. And the first thing to point out is that behavioral options, there have to be behavioral options for people to make choices. If there is no option, you can't make a choice. So something else will determine what you do. But as soon as there are options, as soon as you have some freedom to choose, other psychological factors, for example, come into play. We've talked quite a bit about concern already. I've showed you the findings for concern earlier. I won't explain each one of them. Identity, we haven't talked about so far. If you think you're the sort of person who wants to deal with plastic, that's also a predictor of behavior. Perceived control is a big predictor. This is a subjective feeling that you can do something about it. In every behavior change study, this is important. If you feel totally helpless and it's out of my control, someone else makes these decisions, you won't change your behavior. Values, we've talked about a little bit. Social norms, that came out of the Malisco study earlier. And then these two I've underlaid gray, because I think there are some misperceptions or maybe some over-optimism. in people outside of psychology. What I often hear from the natural scientists is that knowledge is the one and all. So if we just tell people how bad it is, if we tell people scientific facts, ideally in a lot of detail, then they will change. And the literature in behavior change, thousands of studies in health behavior, for example, shows that knowledge in and of itself is not a powerful predictor of behavior. It's sort of cold amotivational. People take it in, but then they don't think about it when they have to make a decision. Similarly with emotions, you often get this perception that if you scare people, if you really make it very drastic and scare them witless, that's going to change behavior. The problem with that is that there are two ways of responding to it. Either you take it on board and you change your behavior. Great, that's a tick. You can use this. Or people become defensive and they start doubting what you're telling them. They start saying, this is just too scary. I can't deal with it. I'd rather watch Netflix. So both of them, it makes sense to think they will work, but be careful in using them. And the other thing I want to point out is for emotions, there are many different emotions beyond fear, both negative and positive. And there are some programs that have used positive emotions such as pride and joy in doing the right thing. Also empowerment, we already talked about, and they work quite well. Of the negative emotions, the only evidence there is really is around guilt. There are a few studies that make people feel guilty. That doesn't feel comfortable either, but it seems to have an effect on behavior. And with knowledge, I just sort of put you off using knowledge, but there is a way of using knowledge. One thing is to make it meaningful to the person you're talking to, so link it to their daily life, rather than bombarding them with scientific detailed information. That's the thing that people can't easily take on board. And the other exception is how-to knowledge. So how do you do something? If, for example, you have a new recycling scheme and people just don't understand what goes in which bin, they need how-to knowledge, of course, in order to do the right thing. So this is often mentioned, but don't forget all the other things and think about these perhaps in a more differentiated way. But these are some of the factors that we know about, and we can use this knowledge to inform behavior change interventions. Now, I want to give you a couple more examples of behavior change that's built on this literature. The first thing I want to just point out is this is a commentary we wrote a few years ago, where we make the argument that you need to meet people's values, people's passions in order to make a change. And what we say in this article is that we go to the supermarket, we're really incredibly busy. We just haven't got the capacity or the time to make very difficult decisions. So to look at a soft drinks bottle, look at the packaging materials in detail. We just need to get home, feed the kids and so on. And what we need to do is make it easy for people to connect the decision they're making with the endpoint, with the impact. So that's what we're sort of saying in this article. We played around a little bit with this idea of adding pictures to consumer items. And you're probably going to say, well, these are quite scary and negative items. And I totally agree with you. So this was a thought experiment. We said this needs to be tested. Does it put people off? Or can we somehow make the message, this is bad, but you can do something about it, which is also a combination that sometimes works. And then I actually got together with some colleagues at UBC who wanted to test this idea. And we used the same idea in a large building, an office building, where they wanted to improve plastic use. They wanted to reduce plastic use. So what they suggest was that we go into the kitchens. There was a kitchen on every floor. I think there were 8 floors in total. And we add the signage around the bins. And the idea was that we test the animal, the impact picture right there at the point of disposal. So this is not about consumption, it's about making the decision in the supermarket, but it's at the disposal point. And we were hoping that would then transfer perhaps to an earlier decision. So we compared 4 different types of signage. This was the control one, something they had already. There was improved signage, which explained the items a bit better than this one. There was our signage plus animal picture. So it just added this vivid picture. And there was one that combined it with a pledge, because pledging behavior has also been found to be successful. And they were on different floors, so we could easily compare this. And what the research assistants did was go to the bins 3 days a week, empty them and count what was in them. So again, really impressed with the effort that went into this. So our target outcome was the percentage of plastic here in the bins. On the left-hand side, you see study 1, where we compared these different bits of these different posters between the floors. What we find was the signage plus animal was the only one that showed a drop in plastic. So plastic use was lower, and it remained lower after posters were removed, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted to see. And other communications, the behavior didn't change, or it increased a little bit. That was great. The company was very happy with this. And they said to us, okay, that's fine. 9 weeks trial over. Now, please, can you just put the poster that works on all the floors? And that's what we did in the follow-up study. And we looked at the bins for another 6 weeks. And I'll just show you the most meaningful, perhaps. This is the condition where there was a control poster replaced by the animal poster. And here we found a drop of minus 24%. So this is, I think, quite encouraging for this idea. And I can't take any credit for this, but it turns out this year, or late last year, the EU came up with new regulation for single-use plastic products, where they use this idea of, don't flick the cigarette butt because it's going to affect the poor turtle. Look at her little head hanging down, being very unhappy. And I think that's fascinating, because that's exactly what we had in mind at the time when we suggested the labeling. So okay, I've got a little bit of time. So final study I want to talk to you about in terms of behavior is a study by my PhD student, Sabine Pahl, who's remained at Plymouth. She's just in her final year now. Sorry, that's the wrong slide. And she's interested in how people differ. So we said earlier, values and passion for the ocean could be a driver of behavior, and ocean connectedness is linked to this. So this is a construct that we adapted from something called nature connectedness, which simply describes people feeling really close to nature. Nature is part of me. I've put a few items there at the bottom. I often feel a sense of oneness with the ocean. Maybe that's a little esoteric, or I feel disconnected. We ask both directions again, as not to bias people. I feel very close to the marine environment. And people answer this, and then you get a score that describes the extent of your ocean connectedness. And with this score, we took into account, we invited these people to do an experimental study where they looked at lots of different bottles. The bottles varied in material. Some were plastic, some were glass, some were the sort of Tetra packs. So they weren't technically bottles, they were Tetra packs. And they also varied in whether they were recyclable or not. So we told them, this is a new context, you don't know anything about it. And we put a label on these bottles. So they looked at all these bottles, and each time they were asked, how willing would you be to buy this? We averaged across all those ratings, all those judgments, and then put that in relation to the ocean connectedness score that we'd measured. And what you can see here is that people who were low in ocean connectedness didn't really care much about the recycling label. These two are pretty overlapping. Whereas those who were high in ocean connectedness, who see a value in the ocean, they really made a difference between the two. So if it was a recyclable product, they were very happy with it. They said, yeah, certainly I'll buy that. If it was a non-recyclable product, they were not happy with it. So it really mattered whether they were connected to the ocean in this purchasing decision. And Sophie is just following this up. This is obviously a correlational study we can't be sure that this is causal, that people who somehow feel higher connected to the ocean will then make better decisions. And she's following this up at the moment, trying to induce ocean connectedness, and she's using virtual reality to do so. So she invites people to the lab. Some of them watch an ocean environment in an immersive fashion, experience underwater scenes and so on. And some of them watch a city environment. That's a classic comparison. And just to show you a couple of examples, this is the sort of thing they see. It's a commercial product. It's actually extremely well made. And she's trying to understand if that affects behavior as well. So we can say something more about the causality. Okay, I think I'm coming sort of to the end of my talk. And at the end, I want to say a little bit more about the policy work I've been doing, and also a bit about international perspectives. And the two are linked, as you will see. Before we go into it, I do have a third interaction. So maybe we can, I think we've got just about enough time to put that in. Judith, could you start that one? So this is asking you about your concern. What are you concerned about? I know we've discussed this a little bit already. We've talked about nature, we've talked about health and so on. This is also asking you to distinguish between macroplastic, big items of plastic, and microplastic. There's 4 questions there. And if you can just say how big is your concern for the 2 types of material and for the 2 types of impact. Even though I can't see you or hear you at the moment, I get some sense that you're there and you're thinking about this. Answers are coming in. Excellent. And again, I think, Judith, if you can show it now. So again, the top answer, the most frequent answer, is marked in orange. Well, just looking at the overall pattern, number 3, so microplastics affecting plants and animals negatively. There, the top answer is extremely concerned. So that's the one that just on first sight sticks out. For the others, it looks fairly similar. Perhaps, again, a bit of a peak here for plants and animals. But human health, maybe I put you off earlier. Human health looks relatively low compared to wildlife. Maybe that's also because you're more in the environmental domain. We've seen that before. We've just got new data, an expert survey on natural scientists, and they also pretty much said we care about wildlife, but not so much about human health. The other thing I can see is that for human health, the microplastics are higher than the macroplastics, which also makes sense. Thank you. Thank you for being willing participants here. So I asked you this partly because I want to come back to a point that I made earlier, which is that with the policy work, I got involved initially because people were really curious about risk perception. So if I just go through some of the reports I've been involved in. So it started with this work for GESAMT, the joint group of experts on scientific aspects of the marine environment. They were particularly interested in microplastics, but they invited me because they said, we just don't understand the human dimension. Can you tell us something, anything about people? And so in the first report, I wrote a little bit about risk perception, risk communication. And I already said to them, you know, let's not stop with risk perception. There's a lot more to people than risk perception. There's behavior change. And I sort of gave them the idea of perhaps including it. And then they said, okay, fine, write something about that in the second, in part 2. So I was quite happy that they listened to it and they seemed interested enough. Then a few years went by and I got involved in the SAPEA report. This is an evidence review that the European Union does regularly on different topics of concern, of interest, and it reports to the EC chief scientific advisors who write their own report. So there's a scientific report, and then that gets digested and looked at and so on, and the chief scientific advisors write their own. And in this case, it was so topical at the time, this was 2019, that we also then went to the G7 meeting who wanted to do something about microplastic. The really exciting thing about this report was that for the first time in my experience with these types of reports, they really wanted to make society central. So the chair of the report, Bart Koolmans, was very clear. We can't just talk about environment. We can't just talk about policies. That's usually what gets covered in the reports. That was a large part of the 2 Gesamt reports. We have to talk about society and all the mechanisms, all the concern aspects, the human dimension. So I was really excited, and he wanted me to be the chair of this society chapter. And that was a totally new experience and very interesting to be that integrated, to really make an attempt to connect the different parts. The other interesting thing about this report is that this was our main summary. Best available evidence suggests that microplastics and nanoplastics do not pose a widespread risk to humans or the environment. And not all the scientists were happy with that. So we got into this debate with 2 colleagues in particular, Heather Leslie and Mike Dipl, who I know well, and projects with them. And they challenged us. They said, well, where's the evidence that human exposure to microplastics is safe? Which is not what we said. We just said we don't have much evidence at the moment. And they were quite unhappy. And they said, no, you can't leave it at that. You need to use the precautionary principle. We said, yeah, we know about the precautionary principle. We still can't pretend there's evidence when there isn't. So we wrote a rejoinder as well. And we said it's important to tell it as it is. We can't alarm people when the evidence isn't there, isn't strong at this point. And we were quite careful in the summary, and we said the evidence is limited. It can change if pollution continues. So we thought we just got it right, but this is a sort of debate that happens. And this was already partly motivated by the human health aspect because people were increasingly concerned about it. So Gesamt did another report about risk assessment, which wasn't really about human health, but there was a huge debate at the meeting already about this. I wasn't directly involved with this one, but I was at a meeting presenting risk perception aspects. And then there are 2 reports that have nothing to do with WHO released last year, and this one is forthcoming now. I was asked to review part of it. That's why I know about it. And again, this concern about human health aspect that you might remember from the BFR work is huge. And policymakers say, people ask us about it all the time. We don't know what to say. And these 2 reports had a similar message to our SAPEA report, that there is not enough evidence at the moment. Work is underway. We will have evidence, but at the moment we can't say anything, which is a really strange situation to be in, because the scientists say we have to have the evidence. We need to make evidence-based policy, but people are already asking for it. They're saying, so what do you do to reduce microplastics in food products, in packaging, etc., etc. So a really fascinating place to be in. Okay, I've got 2 more slides. As long as no one stops me, I will show them. Okay, just sort of on the one side, homing in a bit more on where I am now. I've only been here since October, so I really don't know much about the Austrian context, and I'm really keen to learn more. So I did a little sort of search to think about what's this mean for Austria. And of course, very similar to the rest of Europe, about 50% of plastic rubbish is packaging, which seems a very strange use of this valuable material. Use it once, we throw it away. Surely we can do things differently. And I found this example where someone's worked with packaging. So here's a carton a carton base, which reduces the plastic in this particular. I'm not affiliated with these people. It's just an example. I also found plastic rubbish in the Danube. So it's not just a marine problem. I need to switch from the marine context, but the problems are similar. I also found very good news, highest recycling rates in Austria and Germany. And that's important because there's a new EU rule that says you have to have a higher quota of recycling, even higher than it is already. I found some bad news. This is illegal rubbish that had been exported to Malaysia coming back to Austria. It shows that policies, that new regulations are working, but that's quite unpleasant. And it's even more unpleasant when it comes back. And I found really good news where there's also lots of citizen initiatives where people collect rubbish. They don't want it in the natural environment. Clearly, ocean connectedness might not be the same, and I'd be very keen on your feedback on what we could use here, or whether ocean connectedness is still really relevant. Certainly, nature connectedness is really important. So this is the focus on Austria. Just a few thoughts. I'd like your feedback. And then zooming out again, I'm also involved in other projects around the world: Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Namibia. And I just wanted to say a few things because I think it's important for us to think about plastic as a global problem. And the oceans are a pathway that transports plastic around the world. We really need to think about it. It's not containable within country borders. And there's some interesting work I'm doing with colleagues in Africa where we've been discussing mental models. So what the colleagues in Africa are saying, sometimes in the old days, people would put all their rubbish outside just before it would rain, because the mental model is do that and rubbish gets swept away. And that's in the absence of good waste disposal systems. Now, in the old days, that made perfect sense because you had biodegradable materials. It would go away. It wouldn't do any harm to wildlife, etc. These days, of course, the materials have changed. In some places, people still do this, and that adds to the problem. So we need to think about the waste infrastructure. We need to really think about how to work with people to make these changes. Another thing I've been looking at, in particular with the UNEP project that I've just finished, is how effective bans and other policies actually are. So UNEP is really happy when policies get introduced, when bans get introduced. And I think it's a really good step because it's got signal value, it's really powerful. But there are also instances where this has a backfire effect in the sense that there's suddenly a black market for plastic. And we've got some examples in India, for example, where they banned plastic bags and now they're being sold under the counter. And again, you just have to think about human behavior and what happens if you don't prepare your population, if they don't know what to do instead. It's another project in Namibia that we're working with people on. So I just wanted to raise some of these issues because we sometimes get caught in our perspective and we're like, well, we can do it this way. And it's not that easy. What I also want to say, having worked with people, particularly in our Blue Communities project, there's an incredible resilience. And I just applaud people in these conditions who work together, who are really passionate about the natural environment, in some cases because it's their livelihood and they know exactly what happens when the fish stocks reduce and so on. And it's been an absolute pleasure to work with them and to learn from them how things can be done on a smaller budget. So I just wanted to introduce that thought at the end. This is my final slide. So I hope in the context of transformative change, I've been able to talk you through some ideas that show people's decisions and behaviors are really, really important. They play a key role in this whole issue of plastic pollution. Public concern often drives policy, so we also need to think about it. We don't want public concern to be the only thing that drives policy. That would be quite wrong, but policymakers are keen to know what people think and to guide them perhaps and to take it on board. Policymakers also sort of like the issue of plastic because they don't get a huge backlash. There's no people who say, well, why are you focusing on plastic? It's not a problem. Don't really worry about it. Risk is assessed differently by different people. And I think social and behavioral sciences can introduce something, can add something, contribute something to this. And we need to integrate the human dimension. And I'd say, let's work together on this wicked problem and hopefully make a difference. And I just want to say thank you. I'm not doing this on my own. There's a team working with me, and it's been a great journey that I hope I can continue here. Thank you.